Nobody who worked at Blackwood Estate lasted long enough to learn the layout of the second floor. In 3 years, a German shepherd named Titan had bitten 2 security guards badly enough to require stitches, sent a professional animal trainer fleeing out the front gate before noon, and driven away no fewer than 17 housekeeping staff, some of whom quit within hours of their first shift and never once looked back. The dog had become a legend in the service industry of Lakeview Heights, a cautionary tale whispered between domestic workers at the bus stop, a name that made experienced professionals suddenly remember they had other opportunities. The estate itself, a sprawling glass and stone fortress perched at the edge of a private lake, had earned an unofficial reputation as the most beautiful place in the city that nobody wanted to work inside. And yet, on a gray Tuesday morning in late November, a woman named Naomi Walker climbed the front steps of Blackwood Estate, knocked on the door, and asked for the job. Victoria Blackwell had built her technology empire from a single office above a dry cleaning shop in downtown Lakeview Heights back when she was 23 years old and had nothing but a prototype and a stubbornness that most people mistook for arrogance. By 42, she controlled a corporation with operations across 11 countries, a valuation that financial analysts struggled to write without running out of zeros, and a personal reputation so precisely managed that even her competitors spoke of her with a careful, grudging deference. She did not laugh at press conferences. She did not attend charity galas unless they served a strategic purpose. She gave interviews rarely, answered personal questions never, and had not been photographed in a moment of unguarded emotion in so long that a few tabloid journalists had taken to speculating, in print, about whether she was actually capable of feeling anything at all. The estate on the lake was not a home in any warm sense of the word. It was a headquarters. It was a fortress. It was the place where Victoria Blackwell came to be alone, which was, at this point in her life, the only state of being she fully trusted. The morning Naomi arrived, it was raining the kind of cold, sideways November rain that made the lake look like hammered pewter and turned the manicured grounds of the estate into something gray and slightly ominous. The housekeeper who answered the door was a trim, expressionless man named Mr. Aldridge, who had served the estate for 11 years and possessed the particular skill of experienced household staff everywhere, which was to communicate volumes through a minimum of words. He looked at Naomi, her practical raincoat, her sensible shoes, the small bag she carried, the utterly unhurried way she stood on the step, and said, with the neutrality of someone who had delivered this speech many times, "If you have any fear of dogs whatsoever, I would strongly recommend you turn around now. We have not had success with candidates who underestimate the situation." Naomi looked at him for a moment. "I've worked with dogs before," she said. "I'll be fine." "Mr." Aldridge regarded her with the quiet skepticism of a man who had watched 16 people say variations of the same thing and then watched all 16 of them leave. He stepped aside nonetheless and let her in. The estate revealed itself slowly, the way all truly large houses do: first the entryway, which was already bigger than most apartments, then the double staircase rising into a second floor that felt deliberately removed from the world below, then the long corridors that led toward wings of the house that Naomi would not see for days. Everything was expensive, and almost nothing was warm. The art on the walls was important and cold. The furniture was custom and correct. There were no personal photographs visible anywhere on the ground floor, no half-finished cups of coffee abandoned on side tables, no coats thrown carelessly over chairbacks, none of the small evidence of living that accumulates in a house where someone is actually present in an unguarded way. It was a house that had been designed to impress, and it succeeded, and the success felt like a kind of sadness. "Mr." Aldridge was walking her through the kitchen protocols when Naomi first heard it, a low, sustained growl that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the house, something animal and warning, in a frequency that made the back of the neck respond before the mind did. She paused. Mr. Aldridge did not pause. That, he said, without turning around, would be Titan. At the far end of the main corridor, partially visible through the glass panels of the interior doors, a shape moved. Even from that distance, Titan was larger than most people expected a dog to be, broad through the chest, dark along the saddle, with the controlled, deliberate movement of an animal who understood exactly how much space he occupied. He had stopped at the glass and was watching Naomi with an intensity that was not quite what she would have called aggression, though it was certainly not welcome. His lips were pulled slightly back. His ears were forward. His eyes, amber, steady, almost unblinking, were fixed entirely on her, tracking her with a focus that felt less like animal instinct and more like assessment. Naomi held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then looked away, not out of fear, out of knowledge. "First day, Mr. Aldridge said, appearing beside her with a slight note of something that might have been relief that she hadn't screamed. "You won't need to interact with him. The security staff manage his movement during your working hours." Naomi nodded slowly, still looking down the corridor. "Who manages it on days when they don't?" she asked. Mr. Aldridge took a breath. "Nobody has figured that out yet," he said. The second morning, Titan came through. It was not a catastrophic breach. The security latch on the interior gate had not been properly fastened. A small mechanical failure, with enormous practical consequences. But the effect on the household staff was immediate and total. People cleared the corridor in seconds. A junior groundskeeper backed himself against the wall near the kitchen and did not move for 10 minutes. 2 maintenance contractors who had arrived to check the heating systems found reasons to wait in their van. Titan stood in the main hallway and was, by any objective measure, terrifying. He was not lunging or snapping or moving erratically. He was simply standing there, every line of his body expressing something that communicated danger at a register below language, something that said clearly, "This space is mine. Your presence here is a problem, and I have not yet decided what to do about it." Victoria appeared at the top of the staircase. She was dressed for a morning of calls, impeccable as always, completely composed, and she looked down at the scene below with an expression that was almost impossible to read. She looked at Naomi, who had stopped in the doorway of the kitchen with a mop in one hand and had not moved. "Don't try to make friends with it," Victoria said. Her voice was flat and even, and she was already turning back to her study. "Nobody manages to. Don't waste your time." What Naomi did not say, because it was her second day, and she understood that certain observations were not yet hers to share, was that she was not looking at Titan the way the other staff had looked at him. She was not measuring the distance between herself and the nearest exit. She was watching the dog the way she had been trained, once, a long time ago, to watch animals whose histories she did not yet know, looking not at what was frightening, but at what was underneath the frightening. And what she saw, standing very still in that corridor, was a dog who had turned his head away from the open hallway and was looking, with an expression she would later describe as something close to longing, toward the far left of the ground floor, toward a door that she would eventually learn was always locked. Titan stayed in the corridor for several more minutes, and during those minutes, Naomi noticed that he glanced toward that door 3 separate times. Not at anyone in the corridor. Not at her. At the door. She filed this away without saying anything, finished fastening her apron, and went back to the kitchen to find where they kept the cleaning supplies. In the days that followed, Naomi moved through the estate the way water moves, finding the angles, working around obstacles, taking the shape of whatever space she was given without fighting it. She was efficient and quiet and thorough, and the staff, most of whom had been too startled by her survival to be properly welcoming, began to accept her presence with the pragmatic warmth of people who were relieved to have another pair of hands. She learned where things were kept. She learned which lights flickered. She learned that Mr. Aldridge took his tea precisely at 2:15 and that interrupting this was inadvisable. She learned the schedule of Titan's outdoor movements and began to structure her own work accordingly. Not out of fear exactly, but out of respect for the situation, the way a sailor respects the weather. Not because the weather is evil, but because it is powerful and does not care about you personally. And she kept watching. She watched Titan the way she had always watched animals who were herding carefully, from a distance, without the agenda of fixing or controlling or taming, just the quiet act of paying attention. An older groundskeeper named Douglas, who had survived 3 years of Titan through the simple strategy of never being in the same room, told her one afternoon, while they were both taking shelter from the rain in the garden shed, that the dog had not always been like this. "Used to be the sweetest animal you ever saw," Douglas said, with a kind of bewildered sadness that suggested he still hadn't made peace with what the dog had become. People used to come to the estate just to see him, back when the parties were still happening. He'd let the guests' children climb all over him. And then one night, everything changed. Douglas did not elaborate on what the night was, and Naomi did not push. But she listened, and she remembered, and later that week, when she found herself passing the locked door on the left side of the ground floor, the door that Titan always seemed to be watching, she stopped and looked at it for a long moment before moving on. It was the sound that woke her the first time. She was sleeping in the staff quarters on the third floor, a small but decent room with a window that looked out over the eastern grounds, and it was somewhere just past 3 in the morning when she heard a low, continuous sound from somewhere below, something between a whimper and a howl, something that contained inside it a quality of grief so raw and persistent that she lay in the dark for almost a full minute before she accepted that she was not going to be able to go back to sleep. She put on her robe and went downstairs barefoot, following the sound through the sleeping house, past the kitchen, and down the main corridor, until she turned the corner and found Titan. He was lying on the cold marble floor directly in front of the locked door, enormous and still, his chin resting on his front paws, his sides moving with slow breaths. He was not asleep. His eyes were open. He was watching the door. When he heard Naomi's footsteps, he lifted his head, and the sound in his throat changed a subtle shift in register that she recognized from her years at the shelter as the sound of an animal that was deciding, in real time, whether a situation required aggression or could be allowed to remain as it was. Naomi sat down on the floor. Not close. There were perhaps 4 meters between them, and not in a posture of approach. She folded her legs beneath her and settled her back against the wall and looked not at Titan, but at the door, the same thing he was looking at, as if they were simply two beings observing the same phenomenon from their respective positions in the dark. Titan watched her for a long time. She did not speak. She did not reach out. She did not make any of the sounds that humans generally make toward dogs, the coaxing syllables, the encouraging noises, the vocabulary of managed reassurance that animals who have been hurt learn to distrust. She simply sat there, in the cold, in the dark, present without demand. After a while, Titan put his chin back on his paws, his eyes stayed open, his gaze returned to the door. Naomi sat with him for 40 minutes and then went back to bed. She told no one. In the days that followed, she began to change her approach not dramatically, not in any way that would announce itself or draw the attention of the other staff. She simply allowed her movements through the estate to occasionally take her past Titan's vicinity, and she maintained the same quality of presence she had discovered on the floor that night, close enough to be registered, far enough to be unthreatening, entirely without agenda. She did not try to feed him from her hand. She did not attempt to touch him. She did not crouch down and call his name in the bright, encouraging voice that most people used with dogs, and that Titan, she had learned, seemed to find either threatening or insulting. She simply moved through his world, predictably and quietly, and she let him decide what to do with that. Titan's response was not dramatic. It was almost imperceptible. But it was there. The growling when she passed nearby became less sustained. The rigid alertness he maintained in her presence began, very gradually, to soften at its edges. One morning, she crossed the main hall while he was lying near the fireplace, and she was halfway to the kitchen before she realized that he had not made a sound. Naomi had worked for 2 weeks at Blackwood Estate when she found the photograph. She was cleaning the upper study, one of the rooms Mr. Aldridge had told her she was now cleared to enter, but that required, he said, a certain discretion. And she was moving carefully around the desk when a framed picture on the back shelf caught her eye. It was half turned toward the wall, as though someone had started to put it away, and then changed their mind, and then not completed the reversal. She did not pick it up. She simply looked at it from the angle it presented. A man and a woman, younger than Victoria was now, standing somewhere that was clearly outside this estate, laughing. The woman was unmistakably Victoria Leiter, in some quality that Naomi couldn't precisely name, as if the weight she currently carried hadn't settled on her yet. The man beside her was tall and easy-looking, the kind of person who seemed to take up exactly the right amount of space, and he had one arm around Victoria and the other hand resting on the head of a younger Titan who sat between them with his mouth open, in what could only be described as a grin. Naomi set down her cloth and looked at the photograph for a moment longer than she should have. Then she went back to cleaning and did not mention it to anyone. She asked Douglas about the locked room that same evening, casually, as they were both finishing up in the garden. Douglas took his time answering. He looked out at the lake, where the light was doing something complicated with the surface of the water, and he said, after a while, that the room had belonged to a man named James Victoria's fiancé, who had died in an accident on the estate 3 years ago. He said it carefully, the way people say things about events they were present for and have never fully processed. He said that the accident had happened on the same night that everything changed with Titan, and that after it happened, Victoria had closed the room and nobody had been inside it since. He said that Titan had been with James when it happened. He paused. People said it wasn't the dog's fault, he said. But animals don't know that, do they? They just know what happened and who was there. Naomi was quiet for a long moment. Neither do people, she said. What happened with Titan on the 14th day of Naomi's employment was not something anyone at Blackwood Estate had a framework for. The security latch, which had been repaired after the first incident, failed again, a different mechanism this time, a bolt that had been slightly misaligned since installation, and Titan came through the inner gate at a speed that made 2 of the security staff take an involuntary step backward before they remembered they were supposed to be managing the situation. The dog was not behaving the way he had during previous escapes. He was not standing in the corridor broadcasting threat. He was moving with purpose, and the purpose appeared to be pointed directly at Naomi, who was at that moment crossing the main hall with a basket of folded linens. Every person in the vicinity registered this simultaneously, and the response was immediate. People moved away from the center of the room. Someone shouted Naomi's name, someone else was already reaching for a phone, and Victoria, who had appeared at the top of the staircase at the sound of the commotion, looked down and went very still. Titan was covering the distance between himself and Naomi, at a pace that looked, to everyone watching, exactly like an attack in progress. Naomi saw him coming. She had perhaps 4 seconds to make a decision. She set the basket of linens down on the floor. She turned to face Titan. She lowered herself to her knees slowly, with deliberate calm, not in the posture of someone bracing for impact, but in the posture of someone choosing to meet something at its own level. She did not look directly into his eyes. She kept her gaze soft and angled slightly to the side, and she did not make a sound. The room had gone so quiet that the rain against the windows was the only thing audible. Titan reached her. His momentum should have carried him into her. He stopped. He stood in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, and his breathing was audible and fast, and every muscle in his body seemed to be in some kind of suspended conversation with itself. He lowered his nose toward her hand. He inhaled. The sound he made next was not a growl. It was something altogether different, a sound that had more in common with the noise he made in front of the locked door at 3 a.m. than with anything threatening, something low and internal and released, like a tension that had been held too long, finally finding a direction to go. He folded himself down onto the marble floor in front of her. He put his head on his paws. He closed his eyes. The room did not react immediately. There was a sustained moment of collective disbelief, the kind that takes several seconds to convert into any kind of action. And then someone exhaled, and someone else let out a sound that was not quite a word, and Victoria, at the top of the staircase, had one hand pressed flat against her sternum, and her eyes were wet, and she did not appear to know what to do with her face, which was doing something it had not done in a very long time. She turned and went back into her study before anyone could see her clearly. But Naomi had already seen, and she had understood, in the way that she understood most things about this house, that what she had just witnessed had very little to do with a dog and a domestic worker, and everything to do with a woman standing at the top of a staircase who had just watched something she had given up believing was possible. In the days following what Mr. Aldridge would carefully refer to in his household notes as the incident in the main hall, the atmosphere at Blackwood Estate shifted in a way that was difficult to articulate, but impossible not to feel. Titan was calmer. Not tame, the distinction mattered, and Naomi would have been the first to insist on it, but calmer, the way a body of water is calmer when the pressure system above it changes. He allowed Naomi to pass within arm's reach without commenting. He stopped surveilling the kitchen doorway with the sustained hostility that had made 2 previous staff members quit. He still went to the locked door at night, but the sounds he made there were quieter, as if something internal had been turned down a notch. Naomi began to move through her own understanding of the situation with increasing care. She was gathering information the way she had always gathered it, slowly, from the edges, piecing together a picture from the fragments available to her. And what the picture was beginning to show her troubled her in a way she needed time to think through before she did anything about it. She found the letter while she was organizing the contents of the estate's document room, a task that had been assigned to her because it was unglamorous and time-consuming, and nobody else wanted it. It was in a box of James's things that Victoria had apparently been unable to either open or discard. Sealed in a plain envelope with Victoria's name, written on the front in handwriting that looked like someone who had written it carefully and unhurriedly, the handwriting of a person who expected to be there when it was read. The letter had never been opened. The seal was still intact. Naomi held it in her hands for a long time, sitting in the document room with the single overhead light and the smell of old paper, and she understood exactly how much weight the object she was holding contained, and exactly how many wrong ways there were to handle the next few minutes of her life. James had written the letter the morning of the day he died, which Naomi learned later. She did not read it. That was not something she had any right to do, and she understood that clearly, but she brought it to Victoria. She found the CEO in her study at the end of the working day, alone with a monitor showing figures that probably represented the movement of more money than Naomi would earn in several lifetimes, and she knocked on the open door and said, simply, "I found something that belongs to you." She set the envelope on the desk. She looked at Victoria's name, written on the front, and then she looked at Victoria, and she said, "I think you should know, it was never opened." She left the study and closed the door behind her. She did not wait to see what happened next, but she did not go far either, because she knew with the certainty of someone who has spent years learning to read pain in its various containers that some things should not be done entirely alone. The sound that came from behind the closed door of Victoria Blackwell's study was not loud. It was not the sound of someone losing control in a public way. It was something smaller and more honest than that, the sound of a person who had been holding something for 3 years, encountering the full weight of it all at once, in a private room, with the door closed. It was the sound, Naomi thought, of a wall coming down. She sat in the hallway outside and did not knock. Titan appeared from the direction of the main corridor and walked, unhurriedly, to the door of the study. He sat down in front of it. He looked at Naomi. She looked back at him. They waited. Victoria read James's letter twice. The first time she could not take it in properly. The words kept dissolving into something that was less language and more sensation, like trying to hold water in your hands. The second time she read it slowly, all the way through, forcing herself to stay present with every sentence. He had written it as a kind of insurance policy against the anxiety he had felt that morning, a reassurance he was leaving for her in case anything went wrong with the day he had planned, which had involved a new ring and a view of the lake, and a question he had already asked her once, but wanted to ask again more ceremonially. He wrote about the morning light through the kitchen window. He wrote about the way the lake looked in November. He wrote about something she had said to him 3 weeks earlier that he hadn't had a chance to respond to properly, and that he wanted her to know he had been thinking about. All of it written in that same steady, unhurried hand, the hand of a man who did not know he was writing, the last thing he would ever write to her, and that made it, in some impossible way, even harder to read than if he had known, because it was so completely ordinary in its tenderness, so entirely absent of the gravity that last words are supposed to carry. He had written it the way you write a note to someone you fully expect to see that evening. He had written about Titan with an affection so specific and detailed that it made the chest ache to read. He described the dog the way people describe creatures who have become, over years of daily proximity, genuinely irreplaceable, not as a pet but as a presence, something that understood the household in ways that extended beyond the merely domestic. He had written, explicitly and plainly, that if anything happened to him, she should not let grief make her unkind to the dog. "He will miss me," James had written in that careful, unhurried hand. "He will not understand what happened, but he will feel it, the same as you will. Be patient with him. He was always trying to protect the people he loved." Victoria put the letter down on the desk and looked at the wall and understood, with a terrible, clarifying precision, what she had done. She had locked Titan out. Not from rooms he had the run of the ground floor, but from her. She had been so consumed by her own grief, so certain in the story she had told herself about that night, that she had looked at the only other living thing in the world who had loved James and had treated it as an accusation. Titan had not become aggressive. She had become unreachable. The dog had spent 3 years trying to tell her something she hadn't been able to hear, and he had expressed that impossibility the only way available to him, through the language of his body, and everyone around him had read it as danger. She thought of all the nights she had heard him at the door of James's room, and had turned up the volume on her work calls and pretended not to hear. She thought of the 17 people who had left this house because of something she had created and had called Titan's problem. She thought about the way she had looked at that dog every morning for 3 years, and had seen, instead of grief, threat. Because threat was something she knew how to manage, and grief was something she had decided, in the brutal, practical arithmetic of survival, she could not afford. She had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. She had been magnificently, expensively, exhaustingly wrong, and the knowledge of it sat in her chest now with a weight that was not entirely terrible, because there was something underneath the weight that she recognized, faintly and with great care, as relief. She sat in her study for a long time before she stood up. The door to James's room opened for the first time in 3 years. Victoria used her key, the key she had kept on a ring in her desk drawer and had not touched since the week after the funeral, and the room was exactly as it had been, which was something she had done on purpose. Without fully understanding why, James's books were on the shelves. His jacket was on the chair where he'd left it that morning. There was a photograph on the dresser that she had not been able to look at in 3 years, and that she looked at now, and the feeling was enormous and not entirely composed of grief. It was also something else, something older and harder to name, a kind of love that survives its object and has nowhere to go. She heard the door behind her and turned. Titan was standing in the hallway. He had not been inside this room in 3 years either. He was looking at her, and he was looking at the room, and she could see him processing both things with the kind of attention that animals give to moments they have been waiting for. She stepped back from the doorway. She made room. Titan walked into the room. What happened next was not a scene from a movie, not choreographed or cinematic, and yet it was the most moving thing Victoria Blackwell had witnessed in 3 years of a life that had contained almost nothing she would have described as moving. Titan walked slowly around the room, around the chair, around the desk, past the bookcase, the way a dog catalogs a space, taking in all the information that scent provides, which is a kind of language more complete and less forgiving than any human tongue. He stopped at the side of the bed. He stood there for a moment that lasted just long enough to understand itself. Then he lay down on the floor beside it, in what Victoria slowly recognized as the exact position he had always slept in the years before. She lowered herself to the floor beside him. She put her hand on his flank. He was warm under her palm, and real, and present in a way that very few things in her life had been for a very long time. He made a sound low, releasing, nothing she had a word for, and she bent her forehead down to the side of his neck, and she wept. Not the controlled, private sound from the study. Something more complete than that. Something 3 years in the making. She found Naomi in the kitchen an hour later. Naomi was making tea, and she did not look surprised to see Victoria standing in the kitchen doorway, which itself told Victoria something, though she couldn't have said precisely what. Victoria was still composed in the way that she was always composed. The architecture of her control was too deeply built to simply disassemble. But there was something different in her face, something that had the quality of a room after a window has been opened. "Why weren't you afraid of him?" she asked. The question was direct, which was the only way Victoria knew how to ask questions. Naomi considered this with the same unhurried calm she brought to everything. "I've been afraid of things," she said, "but I've learned that fear usually sits on top of something else. And if you want to understand what you're actually dealing with, you have to look underneath the fear." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "You looked underneath," she said. It was not a question. Naomi set down the tea. "He wasn't angry," she said simply. "He was broken-hearted." Naomi had not spoken much about her own history to anyone at Blackwood Estate, and this was not reticence but privacy, a distinction she maintained with care. People often confused the two, assumed that a quiet person was a closed person, that someone who did not volunteer information was someone who had nothing to offer. Naomi had encountered this assumption her whole life, and had long ago made her peace with it, because she had also learned that the people worth knowing eventually asked the right questions, and the people who didn't were usually not asking because they genuinely wanted the answer. Victoria asked. She asked in the way she asked most things directly, without the social scaffolding of warm-up conversation, the question arriving without ceremony, because she had already decided it was the one she wanted answered. And Naomi answered. She had grown up in a city that was large enough to be anonymous and small enough that you still knew which streets to avoid, and she had learned very early that the world was not organized around fairness, but that this was not the same thing as saying that decency was impossible. Her mother had been a practical woman who taught her that how you respond to difficult circumstances is not a reflection of the circumstances, but of who you have chosen to be, which is a philosophy that sounds simple and proves, in practice, to be the hardest kind of work there is. After college, where she had studied biology with a secondary interest in animal behavior, Naomi had spent 4 years working at a municipal animal rescue shelter in the city, not in an administrative capacity, not in veterinary care, but in direct daily contact with animals that had been surrendered, abandoned, or removed from situations of abuse or neglect. She had worked with dogs that had been used in fighting operations, and dogs that had been left on the sides of roads, and dogs that had never in their lives been touched by a human being without being hurt. The shelter was not a romanticized place. It was often loud, occasionally heartbreaking, and perpetually underfunded, and it demanded from the people who worked there a kind of emotional endurance that most people, if asked directly, would admit they were not sure they possessed. Naomi had stayed for 4 years, and had left not because she burned out, but because a series of circumstances, a family obligation, a relocation, the particular financial arithmetic of a city that was becoming expensive faster than wages were rising, had made staying logistically impossible. She had learned, through accumulated days that were sometimes beautiful and sometimes unbearable, that the expression of aggression in animals almost never means what it appears to mean. "A dog that bites usually isn't telling you it wants to hurt you," she said. "It's telling you it's terrified of being hurt. The teeth are the last resort, not the first impulse. Something has to happen to an animal before it decides that aggression is the only language anyone will respond to." Victoria was listening in a way she rarely listened, without the part of her mind that was already formulating the response, without the executive processing that usually ran parallel to any conversation she engaged in. She was just listening. "I saw Titan," Naomi said, "and I saw what he was carrying, and I thought somebody should stay." Victoria's empire ran on logic and information and the rigorous application of data to problems. She had built it that way on purpose, because she trusted those things more than she trusted the alternatives, and the alternatives had, at a certain point in her life, let her down so completely that she had decided to stop depending on them. But she recognized, in the weeks that followed James's letter and Titan's night on the floor of the old room and the conversation in the kitchen, that there were categories of problems that data could not solve, and that the things she had been most afraid of were not the things she had been protecting herself from. She had been protecting herself from grief, by being productive, filling every quiet hour with an obligation, every empty morning with a call, every evening with work that needed doing, and that could always be made to seem more urgent than it was, because urgency was the most reliable way she had found to keep the larger silence at bay. She had been protecting herself from guilt by being in control, which meant, in practice, that she had spent 3 years holding very tightly to a version of events that cast her as a person managing a difficult situation, rather than a person who had, in her grief and her shock and her complete inability to face what had happened, turned her face away from the one creature who had needed her most. She had been protecting herself from love, the specific, ungovernable vulnerability of it, by reducing her interactions with people to transactions and her relationship with the world to a series of outcomes that could be managed from behind very clean glass. What Naomi had done was not remarkable, in the way Victoria had always defined remarkable. She had not performed any feat of skill or executed any brilliant strategy. She had simply stayed. She had stayed when staying was inconvenient and somewhat dangerous, and she had paid attention when attention required patience rather than analysis, and she had treated a suffering creature with a dignity that did not depend on the creature deserving it in any legible way. Victoria had spent her career rewarding intelligence and execution. What she was looking at now, in Naomi, was something she did not have a good word for in the vocabulary she had built her life around. The closest she could come was courage, though it was not the kind of courage that looked like courage from the outside. It was the kind that looked, from the outside, like simply showing up. Titan began to sleep outside Victoria's study during the working day. This was a development that nobody acknowledged formally, but that everybody noticed, because it was, by any prior measure, impossible. He did not demand to be let in. He did not pace or vocalize. He lay in the hallway with his head on his paws and his eyes half open, and simply maintained his position, the way a loyal thing does when it has finally been given a location it recognizes as appropriate. When Victoria left the study, he stood. When she went somewhere in the estate, he followed at a distance, not crowding her, not asserting himself, just maintaining a proximity that felt, to anyone watching, like accompaniment. The security staff, after a few days of cautious observation, stopped treating Titan as a crisis management problem and started treating him as a fixture. Mr. Aldridge entered a notation in the household log that simply read, "Situation with Titan has stabilized," which was, for Mr. Aldridge, practically a poem. Victoria told Naomi about the foundation idea, the way she told people most things directly, without preamble, presenting it as a fully formed proposal, because she had already thought it through from every relevant angle and had concluded it was correct. They were in the garden, which Naomi had been helping to prepare for the approaching winter, and Victoria appeared with her coat and her precise posture and her way of standing as though the ground belonged to her, and she said, "I want to establish an animal welfare fund, focused specifically on rescue operations and rehabilitation programs. I'd like you to run it." She said it the way she said things that were not questions but that contained, somewhere inside them, the acknowledgement that the other person was permitted to respond. Naomi straightened up from the garden bed and looked at Victoria with an expression that was not surprised she had learned, by now, that Victoria's leaps of decision were always more considered than they appeared, and said, "Why me?" Victoria looked at her for a moment. "Because you understand what it means when something that looks dangerous is actually just looking for somewhere safe," she said. "I need someone who understands that." The foundation launched in the spring, and they named it after Titan, which was Victoria's idea, and which generated, in the weeks following the announcement, a small wave of media interest that neither woman had entirely anticipated. The Titan Foundation, dedicated to rescue, rehabilitation, and the welfare of animals in crisis, was capitalized with a first-year budget that dwarfed the operating costs of every shelter Naomi had ever worked in. And Naomi spent the winter months before the launch thinking very carefully about what that scale of resource actually meant when applied to the specific problem she understood most deeply. There were profiles and photographs, and the kind of earnest human interest coverage that publications produce when a story does not fit neatly into the categories they normally operate in. The photographs showed Victoria Blackwell who had not appeared in an unscripted context in years, standing in a field with a German shepherd who had, in documented fact, once caused 17 people to resign their positions, and she was smiling. Not the calibrated expression she wore at press conferences. Something else entirely. Something that people who had followed her career for years did not recognize at first, and then, when they did, found quietly arresting in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't been watching. The coverage focused heavily on Titan, as coverage about animals tends to, and somewhat less on the organizational infrastructure of the foundation, which was perhaps fortunate, because the organizational infrastructure was genuinely impressive and would have made for less interesting reading than the photographs. On the day of the foundation's public launch, which they held on the grounds of the estate in the first warm weekend of spring, Titan walked among the guests with the equanimity of an animal who had made a fundamental decision about the world and found that the world, presented without the layers of fear and grief that had previously surrounded it, was tolerable. He accepted attention from strangers without flinching. He allowed children to approach him, which they did with the fearless confidence of people too young to have heard the stories, and he responded with the gravity of an elder who has finally been given permission to be gentle. He lay in the sun on the east lawn in the afternoon while the event continued around him, and his eyes drifted closed, and he breathed slowly, and everything about him communicated a dog who had arrived somewhere he could rest. Naomi watched him from across the lawn, and Victoria came to stand beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything. The estate was full of people, which it had not been in 3 years, and the sound of it, voices and laughter, and the particular music of a gathering of humans who are here for a good reason, was something that took both of them a moment to simply stand inside and allow. The light was doing something generous with the lake, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look like it has been thought about. Titan opened one eye, registered them, and closed it again. A small child crossed the lawn nearby with absolute confidence, heading toward a table of refreshments, and Titan watched the child pass with the benevolent, faintly paternal expression of an elder who has decided that the world, on this particular afternoon, is being conducted satisfactorily. "Did you rescue him?" Victoria asked eventually. Her voice was quieter than usual. There was something in it that was different from the precision she normally brought to speech, something that had a texture to it, something that knew it was asking a larger question than the one the words contained, the kind of question that comes out sideways because the direct version is too large to hold all at once. Naomi thought about the night on the cold marble floor. She thought about the 14 days of unhurried presence, the deliberate patience, the decision to stay when staying seemed unlikely to accomplish anything that could be measured. She thought about what it means to witness something in pain and to choose, against every efficient instinct, to simply remain beside it without agenda, without expectation, without any guarantee that the gesture would be received or returned or even noticed. She thought about a dog who had spent 3 years lying in front of a door in the dark, waiting for someone to notice that grief looks different from every angle, and that the thing everyone called a monster was just a creature, trying to remain faithful to something it had loved and lost. She smiled. "No," she said. "He just needed someone to listen." Titan stretched his legs in the afternoon sun, settled deeper into the grass, and breathed. The estate behind them, the glass and stone, the closed rooms slowly opening, the lake catching the light contained, for the first time in a long time, the quality that large houses only acquire when the people inside them are, in some imperfect and ongoing way, beginning to heal. The room that had been locked for 3 years was unlocked now, and the photographs that had been turned to face the wall were visible, and the jacket that had remained on the chair was still there, but no longer felt like an accusation. It felt, Victoria had told Naomi once, tentatively, like a memory she was finally allowed to have. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was sleeping in the sun, and 2 women who had arrived in each other's lives through a door neither of them had intended to walk through were standing in the warmth, not saying much, which was all they needed to say. Because sometimes the most dangerous-looking things are not angry. They are only waiting for the one person patient enough to understand that underneath the teeth, underneath the terror, underneath every wall that grief builds out of its own wreckage, There is something that simply wants to be heard. And sometimes, the one person patient enough is someone no one expected. Someone who arrived on a rainy November morning with sensible shoes and an unhurried way of moving through the world, and who knelt down in the face of what everyone else had decided was a monster and simply stayed. And sometimes that is exactly why it works. Not because the staying was heroic, but because it was enough. Because it turned out that enough was always what was needed. And sometimes the only difference between a creature in pain and a creature at peace is the arrival of one person willing to sit down on the cold floor in the dark and refuse, simply and completely, to leave.